There is no elf who is quite as noble and honourable and wonderful as Lord Finrod Felagund. Maya Gavan and Melanin and Menexwilaid. My name's Rainbow Dave and welcome to our first special bonus character breakdown video on this channel. And I can think of no better character to start with than my favourite elf in the entire Legendarium. Well, joint favourite. So the reason that I'm releasing this video now is because in the last video in this playlist, and this is a spoiler if you've not yet seen it, Finrod Felagund dies. And so I want to take a short break from the tale of Beren and Lúthien to focus solely on the life of Finrod in its entirety and to try and explain, like retroactively, why this guy is so special. So I guess the first thing to talk about in regards to Finrod Felagund is his family. Because as awesome as Finrod is, he is not the most famous of all his siblings. The younger sister of Finrod is, of course, Galadriel. And I think that understanding the story of Finrod in the First Age is a great way to deepen our appreciation for Galadriel in the Third Age. And although Finrod's father is less famous than Galadriel, he is no less awesome. But to fully get your head around this, we're going to have to take a look at one of the most important and also one of the most confusing family trees in the entire Legendarium. And the reason that this family tree is so confusing is because so many people in this family have such similar sounding names, and they're all such important characters. But I'll start right at the top of the tree with Finrod's grandfather, Finwë. Finwë was the first ever High King of the Noldor, and as you probably already know, the Noldor are one of the three clans of the Calaquendi, the High Elves of the Uttermost West, the Elves of Valinor. And throughout the Silmarillion, the Noldor are by far the most important of the three clans, but I do want to briefly mention the other two clans right now, because Finrod Felagund is such an incredible fusion of all three Calaquendi clans. So, the smallest and least important to the story, but also probably the most powerful clan, are known as the Vanyar. And these guys are pretty much perfect. In fact, that's why they hardly feature in the story. They are described as the Fair Elves or the Light Elves, and they're pretty instantly recognizable by their stunningly golden hair. Although, I must point out that not all golden-haired elves are Vanyar. In fact, there isn't a single full-blooded Vanyarine character that appears in the Legendarium as anything more than a minor character. But the Vanyar are the most beloved elves of Manwë and Varda, who are the king and queen of the Valar, the two most powerful beings in all of Arda, not including Melkor, who's lost a great deal of his power by the time that Finrod comes onto the scene. Anyway, we are told that Manwë and Varda are the ones who gave the Vanyar the gifts of song and poetry. And as I say, the Vanyar do just spend pretty much the entirety of the story living in peace and paradise in their city of Valimar alongside the gods and angels of Tolkien's Legendarium. They may not be the most interesting elves, but if you were going to be an elf, you could do a lot worse than being one of these guys. Anyway, the second clan of the Calaquendi are the Noldor, and these are the ones that you probably know all about. Most of the main elven characters in the Silmarillion are Noldorin, and they are the ones that I've spent the most time talking about on this channel. You know, Feanor, Fingolfin, Fingon, Turgon, Maedhros, Celebrimbor, Gil-galad, Glorfindel, Ecthelion, all of them are Noldor. And they are known for their might and their skill at crafting and their pursuit of knowledge. And the final clan of the Calaquendi are the Teleri, and the Teleri are best known for their love of music and singing, and particularly their love of the sea. The Teleri of Valinor are sea elves. So keep these three clans in your mind, because they are all an important part of why Finrod is such an important character. Anyway, back to the family tree of the Noldorin princes. Finwë has 3 sons, and all three of them have confusingly similar names. First, there is Feanor, an incredibly important character in the Silmarillion. He is the maker of the titular Silmarils, the most subtle in mind and the most skilled in hand of any elf ever, and also the guy who led the rebellion of the Noldor that ended up getting them banished from the West. And Feanor is a very complex character who is great in some ways, but also is really, really terrible in other ways. Anyway, Feanor had two half-brothers, and they are Fingolfin and Finarfin. And so these three brothers become the patriarchs of the three houses of the princes of the Noldor. But the fact that Fingolfin and Finarfin are half-brothers with Feanor is very important. Because before Fingolfin and Finarfin were born, their father Finwë lost his wife, Feanor's mother, and so he remarried. And so the mother of Fingolfin and Finarfin is a lady called Indis of the Vanya. She is not of the Noldor. She is one of the very few named Vanyarin characters. And the reason this is significant is because the firstborn son of Indis's second-born son is, of course, Finrod Felagund. Although Finrod is a lord of the Noldor, his grandmother is one of the Vanya, and it is from her that Finrod and all his siblings, including Galadriel, get their golden hair. Now, I imagine in the future, when I finish the tale of Beren Lúthien, I'll probably do character breakdown videos like this one for Feanor and Fingolfin, as they are both very important characters who are now dead. But in this video, the brother to focus on is Finarfin, the least famous and least relevant of Finwë's sons, but in some ways my favourite. And the reason Finarfin matters right now is because he is, of course, the father of Finrod. But whereas both Feanor and Fingolfin can at times be quite prideful, and they do both make some questionable decisions, although one much more so than the other, Finarfin is not like that. He's just a really humble, really lovely, really chilled out prince, and he's not as famous as his brothers because he simply doesn't concern himself with all of their baggage. He is content to live in paradise and not go making waves. And I really think this pure goodness and kindness and respect for life is inherited by Finarfin's son, Finrod. But in talking about Finrod's family, there is one more very important character to mention, and that is Finrod's mother, Eärwen. So, just like Finrod's grandmother Indis, his mother is also not one of the Noldor, but unlike Indis, she's not one of the Vanya either. Eärwen is a princess of the Teleri. In fact, she is the daughter of the High King of the Teleri, and this of course means that although Finrod is considered a great prince of the Noldor, as he is a grandson of Finwë, he is actually only 25% Noldor. Through his grandmother, he is 25% Vanya, and through his mother, he's 50% Teleri. Which means, more so than most other elves, Finrod really does represent the union of all three of the mightiest elven clans, the three clans of the High Elves, of the Calaquendi. And so, obviously, the same is also true of Galadriel. So when considering either Finrod or Galadriel, keep that in your mind. These guys are the opposite of, like, purebred, and yet they are among the most powerful of all elves. Anyway, just like the rest of his immediate family, Finrod was born in the uttermost west, in Valinor. And what's interesting is that he was born in the exact same year as his cousin Turgon, the son of Fingolfin. Although, to be fair, years do mean something very different at this point in the story, as the sun does not yet exist. But the reason that I think this is significant is that Finrod and Turgon are not only very close in friendship, but thematically there are a great deal of parallels between them. And I'll explain what I mean by this in just a few minutes. However, Finrod's first important action in the Legendarium comes while he and his family are still in Valinor. When Finrod is 1,868 years old, uncle Feanor began the rebellion of the Noldor, which, to be fair to Feanor, was a response to the Dark Lord Melkor's theft of his Silmarils and the murder of Finrod's grandfather, Finwë. Now, if you want to learn more about this hugely important part of the Legendarium, I have a whole playlist about Feanor and the Silmarils and the Rebellion of the Noldor to check out if you haven't already. But as a very, very, very brief overview, basically, Feanor incited many of the Noldor to join him in rebellion, and they marched out of their capital city to journey away from the Undying Lands and to move towards Middle-earth in order to get these Silmarils back and to take vengeance on Morgoth. But not all of the Noldor were equally willing to follow Feanor into exile, and among the most reluctant of the Noldor were the followers of Finarfin, the most peaceful group of which Finrod was a leading member. However, interestingly, Finrod's sister, Galadriel, was not among this peaceful third group. At this moment in the story, she followed her uncle Feanor. She wanted to go to Middle-earth and to rule a realm of her own. But then things begin to go horribly wrong, and the host of Feanor, minus Galadriel, end up murdering a whole bunch of innocent Teleri. It is remembered as the Kinslaying at Alqualondë, and it really is one of the darkest chapters in this part of the story. It's frankly unforgivable. Even Feanor's most die-hard fans cannot possibly justify this moral atrocity. And what's particularly tragic is that unknowingly the host of Fingolfin do end up taking part in this kinslaying, in this massacre, and they fight alongside the warriors of Feanor. But the followers of Finarfin do not. Finrod's hands are entirely clean of the kinslaying. He and his siblings are among the only named exiles that come to Middle-earth without the stain of blood upon them. And, as I mentioned a few moments ago, these murdered Teleri of Alqualondë are Finrod's family. His mother is the daughter of the king of these people that Feanor slaughtered. The brother of Finrod's father has just murdered the kin of Finrod's mother. It must be a crazy ordeal for Finrod and his siblings. And I will just point out quickly that although Galadriel did follow Feanor to Alqualondë, she did not join him in the kinslaying, and in fact she actively fought against him in defense of her mother's people. So Galadriel is also unstained by the doom of the Noldor. Anyway, at this point, Finrod's father Finarfin has had enough, and he takes his group of peaceful Noldor back to Valinor, and he repents, and he severs all ties with his psychotic half-brother Feanor, and that is Finarfin's last appearance in the story for a really, really long time. He just kind of stays in Valinor, and he rules as the High King of the Noldor in the West, in Paradise. But his children do not join him. And I find this fascinating, because Finrod was so against journeying to Middle-earth in the first place, but he chooses not to follow his father back into peace. Instead, he journeys with his other, much more reasonable uncle Fingolfin, and along with Galadriel and his 3 other brothers, he crosses into the east and he settles in Middle-earth, specifically in Beleriand, as an exile. And Finrod's reasons for doing this are very interesting to look at, because, more so than even most of the elves, he is giving up so much by choosing to leave Valinor. Unlike all of his cousins, he is not following his father, he is leaving his father. And unlike even his siblings, Finrod is also leaving behind the woman that he loves. We are told that Finrod's lover is a maiden of the Vanyar called Amarie. But Amarie does not join him in exile. She stays in the West, and neither of them have any reason to believe that they will ever see each other again. Whereas Galadriel and at least one of Finrod's brothers are destined to find love in Middle-earth, Finrod must leave his behind. So why does Finrod make this choice? Why leave Finarfin and Eärwen and Amarie to journey into the dark and dangerous lands under the dominion of Melkor, or Morgoth as he is now known? Well, I think a big part of it is that he doesn't want to abandon his siblings and his cousins to the rash leadership of Feanor, but in Finrod's case, I think there is something more to it than that. I've talked quite a lot in previous videos about this plan of Ilúvatar's, this plan with a capital P. And perhaps more so than pretty much any other elf, Finrod truly is an agent of this plan. If Finrod specifically never journeyed to Middle-earth, so many things would fall apart. He has a fate to fulfill, and it's his destiny to move just enough pieces into just the right places to ensure that Morgoth will one day be defeated. In that sense, he reminds me a little bit of Gandalf. You know, Gandalf isn't the one to destroy the ring, and he isn't the one to unite the Dunedain, and he isn't the one to slay Smaug, and he isn't the one to accompany Frodo into Mordor, and yet his actions are instrumental in igniting that spark, in knocking down that first domino, in setting up the chain reaction that ultimately topples a Dark Lord. And it's the same with Finrod. So, for the rest of this video, I'll talk briefly about all the things that Finrod does in Middle-earth to dictate the future of the First Age and to fulfill the designs of Ilúvatar. And I'll begin by segueing back to Finrod's cousin, Turgon, the second son of Fingolfin. And Turgon is a character that I have mentioned once or twice on this channel, but I've yet to spend a great deal of time with him. And that's because during this part of the story, Turgon's whereabouts are like completely unknown to most other people in Beleriand. However, before Turgon disappeared into the mountains, he spent a day out with his cousin Finrod. And on this day out, Finrod and Turgon went on a delightful walk down the river Sirion. And there they camped along the riverbanks, and both of them were laid into a deep sleep by the Valar Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, one of the top 5 most powerful beings in the entire universe. And while they were asleep, both Finrod and Turgon received visions and warnings in their dreams, and they were both inspired to build hidden, secret, elven strongholds in Beleriand that would endure if Morgoth ever conquered the north. Now, Turgon famously went on to found the super secret elven city of Gondolin, which I will do a whole playlist about when we get there, but Finrod founded a realm of his own, Nargothrond, a safe haven for all free peoples. And Nargothrond is one of the things that Finrod is most famous for, because although Finrod was the one who received the divine inspiration from Ulmo, he did not build Nargothrond on his own. Instead, he developed a wonderful friendship with the dwarves of Beleriand, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, and it was they who fashioned many of the halls and chambers in Finrod's underground secret realm. But the dwarves did more than just build a stronghold. They gifted Finrod a great many treasures from their mines, including an exquisite necklace called the Nauglamir. But it was also the dwarves who gave Finrod his epithet, Felagund. In their dwarven Kuzdul language, they called him Felakgundu, which means hewer of caves, and it is this Kuzdul word that we see Sindarinized into Felagund. I know that later in the Legendarium we see a real rivalry between elves and dwarves, but in the case of Finrod and the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, this is simply not so. Finrod Felagund has a wonderful relationship with the dwarves, and they love him very much in return. And before I move on from Nargothrond, I will say that Finrod also built another stronghold in Beleriand, which I talked a lot about in the last video. And that stronghold is the Elven Watchtower upon the island of Tol Sirion, the Tower of the Guard, which interestingly translates into Sindarin as Minas Tirith. But just like what will happen to the much more famous Minas Tirith in the Third Age, this Minas Tirith comes under attack by Sauron, and the entire island is eventually conquered and corrupted into Sauron's island of werewolves, the same island of werewolves where Finrod is killed. He built the tower, but he later dies in its dungeons. So sad. Anyway, before we get to that, there is one more hugely important thing that Finrod does during his life, and it is this that probably has the greatest repercussions after his death. Because Finrod Felagund is the first being in all of Beleriand to encounter the race of men. Finrod awakens these men from their sleep with the sound of his elven music. And we are told that it is this music that ennobles the first men of Beleriand. Finrod develops a beautiful bond with a man called Beor the Old, and by extension he sort of becomes like the patron saint of the entire house of Beor, one of the three clans of the Edain, the elf friends among men. In fact, it is Finrod who introduces the race of men to the other elves of Beleriand, and throughout the rest of his life he becomes a sort of guardian of men, an ambassador to liaise between them and the High Kings of the elves. So, Finrod Felagund, the Noldorin prince with a Tellarine mother and a Valinor grandmother, and also a Valinor lover, is beloved by the dwarves and revered by men. More so than anyone else, at least in the First Age, Finrod really is the focal point around which so many other things orbit. He is a legend in every sense of the word. And this pretty much catches us up with what I've talked all about in this Beren and Lúthien playlist. During the fourth great battle of Beleriand, the Dagor Bragolach, Finrod is almost slain, but his life is saved by the great-great-great-grandson of Beor the Old, the guy that he befriended hundreds of years ago. And this great-great-great-grandson is, of course, Barahir, the father of Beren. In gratitude for Barahir saving his life, Finrod takes off his ring and he gives it to Barahir. Over the next 6,500 years, this ring will become known as the Ring of Barahir, and over the ages it will eventually find its way onto the finger of Aragorn, before he gives it as an engagement ring to Arwen. Which means that by the time of The Lord of the Rings, this Ring of Barahir, formerly known as the Ring of Felagund, is one of the oldest artifacts in all of Middle-earth. It's older than the sun. Anyway, as I'm sure you all know, Barahir dies, but his ring passes to Beren. And when Beren is given the seemingly impossible task of reclaiming a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown, he journeys to Nargothrond to enlist the aid of Finrod Felagund. Finrod requires no ring to remind him of his oath of abiding friendship, and so Finrod leaves his secret realm and he journeys with Beren to protect him and to aid him on his quest. He duels Sauron in an epic battle of magic and music, and then, of course, Finrod is killed. He dies to save Beren. He dies to ensure that Beren will live and his quest will succeed. The quest that will change the fate of the First Age forever. So, as we move forward with the story of Beleriand in a post-Finrod Felagund world, try to remember all the different ways that Finrod shaped and changed Beleriand while he was in it. And I think what makes Finrod's contributions even more spectacular is that although we often think of the most powerful elves as being these super ancient beings, I mean, Galadriel is 8,374 years old when she finally departs Middle-earth at the end of The Lord of the Rings, but Finrod is only 2,381 when he dies. That's younger than Arwen is in The Lord of the Rings. And look, I know 2,300 years is still a really long time, but remember, Finrod was already 1,916 when he arrived in Middle-earth, which means everything that Finrod did between coming to Beleriand and dying there The founding of Nargothrond, of Tol Sirion, his friendship with the dwarves, his relationship with Eleuthingol, his relationship with all men, and his oath to Barahir and Beren, all of it takes place in the last 465 years of his life. However, unlike most characters, Finrod's story does not actually end with his death. Tolkien rewards Finrod with a lovely little epilogue. Because, as I mentioned towards the beginning, Finrod is relatively unique among the princes of the Noldor in that he never did anything wrong, and he did so much right. He was a faithful agent of Ilúvatar's plan right until the very end. When he died, his soul was held and judged in the halls of Mandos, as all elven souls are, but Finrod is the only elf that we're told of who died in the First Age and then was released before the end of that age. We can speculate that some other dead Noldor, such as Fingolfin, would also have been reincarnated eventually, as he was a thoroughly good guy, but he wasn't perfect. He has atoning to do, but Finrod really doesn't. While his family and his friends are judged in death, we are told that Finrod walks with Finarfin, his father, beneath the trees in Eldamar. And there he is reunited with his mother Eärwen and his lover Amarie. So, just before I end this video, I want to skip forward for a moment about 6,585 years from the time of Finrod's death. Because in a very different part of Middle-earth, 6,585 years later, there is only one member of Finrod's family who is still left alive. And that is, of course, Galadriel. And as every single one of you will know, during The Lord of the Rings, Galadriel gives to Frodo her phial, the Light of Eärendil, and this phial is crucial in Frodo's quest. Without it, it's very unlikely he'd have succeeded. It's very unlikely that Sauron would have fallen. And the reason that I bring this up is because it was at Sauron's hand, albeit a little indirectly, that her brother Finrod Felagund was killed. In the thousands of years that followed, Galadriel really seems to have picked up her brother's baton and become one of the chief movers and shakers in Middle-earth. Obviously, she has a ton of reasons for opposing Sauron throughout the Second and Third Ages, but one of them is incredibly personal. Galadriel gave to Frodo the gift that allowed him to bring about Sauron's ruin, and in doing so, she took down the guy who killed her brother 6,500 years ago. So, that's it for this video, but in the next one I will jump right back into the thick of Beren and Lúthien, and I will continue with their story and with the trials and tribulations that they still have to go through before arriving at the gates of Angband. So to make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. Anyway, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and navaer melyn.